In this video, we're going to take a look at how we can communicate between a fragment and the host activity. Now, there could be a variety of ways that you could accomplish this, I suppose, but what I'm going to show you guys is the most standard and the most well-accepted pattern of allowing a fragment to communicate back with the main activity. Now, why is that important? Because you might look at this the screen here and see we have two login forms, and one's on the tablet, one's on the phone. They look different. We accomplish this through a variety of different tricks in our resources. And you might look at the fragment and say, well, that's just a view. You're basically just doing an include. Well, that's not really what fragments are all about. In the last video, I tried to make it clear that fragments are they're their own encapsulated bit of logic. They contain both the view itself as well as any logic that goes with that view. Meaning, what I want to have happen here is I don't just want to have my login form reuse the view on a phone and on a tablet. What I want to have happen is I want all of the logic that has to do with logging in with the username and password to be in that fragment itself, so that the functionality doesn't change between the phone and the tablet. However, it still is going to be important for the fragment to communicate back with the activity. Now, it's not going to be a low-level sort of notification. It's not going to be, oh, the user hit the login button. That's not an event I'm interested about. What I'm interested about is when the operation itself completes at a higher level. I want this fragment to be able to notify the parent activity, the attached activity, when there is a successful login. That's really what I'm looking at. I think that will make the most sense for a communication protocol between the fragment and the activity. So that means that the fragment itself will handle everything from validating the username and password to actually sending the web request to get your auth token to actually perform the logging in, as well as returning any errors and so on, setting the auth token, saving it to shared preferences, and a bunch of other stuff we haven't yet talked about. So that's going to be the responsibility of the login fragment. The parent activity just needs to know when there was a successful login. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that. That's going to be the main point of this video. There's a little bit of just a little bit of refactoring, not really refactoring, but a little bit of an added feature that I need to implement before we go ahead and start talking about how to communicate between fragments and activities. And that is, the way that I want to go ahead and do this is, you see here, we're looking at the same activity, right? On the phone and the tablet, the same activity. It has a different layout, but it's the same activity. When I press this "You're a login," however, this button that isn't present on the tablet, I get taken to a new activity. I want the actual logic, the real logic for what happens when you successfully log in, not to be repeated. Meaning, I want this activity, this parent activity, the login activity itself to be notified when a successful login happens. Now, that's easy on this side, on the tablet, because we have our login form right here. We just can communicate with the fragment in the way that I'm going to describe here shortly. But on the phone, on the right-hand side, you can't really do that because we have two activities, right? We have this one, and then we have our narrow login activity. So what I'm going to do, I think the most straightforward way to facilitate the ability to keep all the login logic in one place will be for when this activity finishes logging in, the login fragment on this activity finishes, it will return a result back into the login activity. Then the root login activity will be able to decide what to do. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to implement this button as a start activity for result, which we've already seen an example of. But I'm going to do that so that when this activity is finished and it's successfully logged in, the actual logic for what happens when you're logged in occurs on this page, or this activity rather. So let's go ahead and get started. I think I've talked enough for the intro to this video. All right, so what are we going to do? We are going to jump into our activities, into our login activities. So basically what I want to do here is I need to go about creating a result ID that we can pass into the start activity for a result method. So what I'm going to do is come up here to the top of the file and say private static final int request underscore Let's call this narrow login. And I'm going to set this to be equal to 1. So this is going to be how we'll track our result. Now the next thing I need to do is down here on the onClick handler for our login button, I need to change this start activity to something different. I need to change it to start activity for result. Again, what this will allow us to do is it'll allow us to retrieve the result for the parent or for the login narrow activity when it's finished doing its thing. Then I'm going to do comma, and I'm going to do pass in a request narrow login. Okay, the next thing I want to do is let's go ahead and implement the callback for this now. So you guys are going to see the actual logic that happens when we're logged in. It's not scary, I just want to get this out of the way so there's a little bit less jumping back and forth between files. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and implement the protected void on activity result method, which if you recall is the method that Android will invoke when an activity that we started for a result returns. So in this case we're going to do int request code followed by int result code followed by intent data. All right, next up I'm going to say if I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to say if result code is result underscore okay or is not result underscore okay, then return. Then I'm going to say if request code equals request narrow login, then I'm going to say finish login. Now, so what's going on here is if the result code was not a result okay, then return. That could mean, for example, that the user pressed the back button from the login narrow activity and jumped back into this activity. Then I'm going to check the request code, which again is going to be the parameter, the argument that we pass into this parameter to allow us to identify what exactly activity was returned. Anyway, so if the request code is the narrow login, then finish login. Now finish login is a method that I haven't written yet. So let's go ahead and write it. Over here I'm going to say private void finish login. And what is going to happen when we finish the login, when we successfully log in? Well, the code is actually, for now, going to be very straightforward. It's simply going to be start activity, new intent, this main activity class, and then finish. So finish login starts the main activity and finishes itself. Really straightforward. Why do we even bother having a finish login method if it's that straightforward? Well, the reason is there's going to be multiple places that are going to funnel into this finish login. Like if you do a register, or if you log in through Facebook, or if you log in through the login form that's presented to you inline when you're on a tablet. So that's why we have to have this finish login method be its own thing. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to do here on login activity. Let's go ahead and I want to start off by, on my login narrow activity, I want to go ahead and I want to write code that will allow me to communicate between the login narrow activity and the login fragment. So again, here's the login fragment. It's a simple fragment. It extends our base fragment, which extends fragment. And all it does is it inflates a view. Not too exciting. Okay, so what I want to do here is the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and get a reference to that button, right? The login button itself. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create a local field or a private field for that button. I'm going to say private button login button. Of course, again, I have to point this out every now and then, but you guys should be really getting used to this, the fact that we have an import statement for widget.button now, and I got that through the hitting enter on the autocomplete. Anyway, so we have our login button, and what I'm going to do here is on create view, I'm going to say login button equals cast a button, view, find view by ID, r.id login button, which it's actually fragment underscore login button is the name, or is that ID. So if you recall, that is going to be the button that's defined here inside of our fragment view file right there. Okay, so now that we've aliased out our login button, let's go ahead and do login button.set on click listener this. And I'm going to go ahead and put my keyboard cursor inside the red squigglies. Then I'm going to hit Alt-Enter, and I'm going to say make login fragment implement on click listener, hit Enter, and then hit Enter. Now this class implements view on click listener, and we have a corresponding on click method. I'm going to rename this parameter that I find really obnoxious because one letter parameter names are just awful. And on the on click, I'm going to say if view equals login button, then, well, what do we do in this case? Well, I'm just going to put a comment here. Notify parent activity. All right. So now we have all the cruft out of the way for hooking up into our login button. Now we actually have the problem of how do we notify the activity. Well, I kind of gave you guys a hint in the last video when we talked about the base fragment. If we jump into the base fragment, we notice that there seems to be this method called getActivity. That seems very, very promising, right? Well, it turns out that the getActivity method really does just return the activity that this fragment is attached to. Meaning, that seems like the perfect way to notify the activity that one of our fragments has done something. Okay, so we can get the activity, right? But what then? Because if we get activity, notice the return type of this method. The return type of this method is just a normal Android activity. So what do? I mean, we can't really notify it through the base Android class because it doesn't have any user-made methods that we might be able to invoke. Well, we could do this, of course. We could say getActivity cast to backwards apparently cast to login activity getActivity dot finish login. We could do this, but by doing that we have now tied our login fragment to one activity. So now our login fragment can only interact with one activity that's attached to, right? Because that's a login activity. We hard-coded that in. Now you might say, okay, well, we can do a test. We can see if you are the login activity, invoke this method on the login activity. If you're not a login activity and you're a login narrow activity, invoke that method. Well, that's just a hack. We need a generalized way to notify the the activity that we're attached to about specific events that are specific to this particular fragment. The way that we're going to do that is using the language feature that's built explicitly for this purpose, and that is an interface. So what I'm going to do here is at the bottom of this file, I know that I have a syntax error right here, we'll correct this later. At the bottom of the file, I'm going to go ahead and say public interface callbacks, and then I'm going to say void on logged in, and I could put another callbacks I wanted to, any sort of method, because it's an interface, right? I mean, this is what interfaces are for. The idea is that with this interface, any activity that implements this interface will properly know how to be communicated with for this login fragment, right? Because we're going to now enforce that our login activity and our login narrow activity implement this interface, which gives our login fragment a really nice, straightforward way for invoking, passing messages back to its parent activity. So now we can replace this code with cast to callback, getActivity. Of course, there's multiple. There's a lot of callbacks. Let's fully qualify this. By the way, this isn't the final code yet, so don't worry about writing this. Unlogged in. Okay, so we could write the code like this. This actually is very close to a very good implementation of how we should handle these sort of problems, right? Because we have this interface that our activities can implement, and if they implement that interface, they're compatible with the login fragment. However, there's one better way to do this, and the reason why this is a better way, it's kind of twofold. First of all, it's what we're going to do is instead of casting the getActivity call directly to our login callbacks, what we're going to do is we're going to hook into an event from the login fragment called onAttach. Now, the onAttach method is invoked when this fragment is attached to an activity, another well-named thing in the Android API. And as a result, what we can do is we can actually do a check, right? So we can say if the activity that we're attached to does not implement this interface, then throw an exception. The reason we're doing this is to just make it less or more difficult to misuse this fragment. We want to make sure that whenever this fragment is attached to an activity, that it implements this interface, because otherwise it's not equipped to work with this fragment, right? So what we need to do is the second we're attached to an activity, we need to check to see if that activity implements these callbacks. If it doesn't, we'll throw an exception and potentially crash the application, which in this case would be a good thing, because remember, crashing an application is a perfectly valid thing to do if what you're crashing about is a programmer bug. That's something that should be addressed, basically an assertion. All right, so let's go ahead and fix this code. So what I'm going to do here is the first thing I'm going to do is up at the top of the file, underneath my private button, login button, I'm going to say private callbacks. The reason I'm doing this is not only are we going to check to see if the activity that we're attached to implements callbacks, but we're also going to cache the result of the cast so that we don't have to repeatedly cast it every time we want to use it. All right, so then I'm going to say override, and then we're going to say public void on attach activity. On attach activity. So the onAttach method comes from us from the fragment class, and the first thing, of course, we're going to do is do super onAttach, just like usual. And again, this method is invoked when we're attached to an activity. So let's go ahead and set this up. So what I'm going to do here is going to be pretty straightforward. It's not going to be obvious exactly what I'm doing here or how this is going to work if you don't know Java. What I'm going to do here is say callbacks equals callbacks activity. And that's it, really. That's all we need. The reason for that is if this cast succeeds, if the activity that we are now attached to implements this interface, then callbacks will be assigned to the appropriate value. If, however, the activity does not implement callbacks, we will get a runtime exception, specifically a class cast exception, that tells us that there's an error. And since it's an exception, it'll bubble up to the top of the stack and it'll terminate our application, which in this case is exactly what we want to have happen, because if we try to attach this fragment to a activity that's not set up to handle it, we want the application to crash. Now, there's another thing that we want to handle, and that is detach. So I'm going to say override public void on detach and super on detach, and then callbacks equals null. So why am I doing this? Now, you should be able to see that the onDetach method is the opposite of the onAttach method. OnDetach gets invoked when we're no longer attached to an activity. And then we set callbacks to null. That's important because not all fragments will have the same lifetime as an activity. It's possible for fragments to stick around between activity restarts. And the reason why this is important for us to understand is because by not resetting a reference back to our old activity, we're doing two things. We're keeping a reference to an old activity, which is an actual memory leak. A memory leak in the case of a managed language simply refers to a person having a variable that points to an object, even though that object's no longer used. That's what we call memory leaks in managed languages. And so if this fragment outlives the first activity it was attached to, then we have a problem. Now, you might say, well, that's not a big deal because the onAttach invocation should happen when it gets reattached to whatever activity it might get reattached to, thus removing the memory leak. That is true. However, it's still important to just be clean, really. Be clean about your references. Not only that, it's also important that I consider it to be an error if this login fragment performs a login and is no longer attached to an activity. I consider that to be an error in my code. And the way that I can go about making it so I get an actual runtime exception is by setting it to null. Because if this fragment, for whatever reason, is left around in memory after it's detached from its first activity, and it's not reattached to another activity, and it's still in memory, and it does something for some reason, and it tries to invoke something on the callbacks, I don't want that call to succeed, because that means something really weird is going on with the program, right? And so what will happen is by setting it to null here, whenever we try to access this variable, we'll get a null reference exception, which, again, in this case, an exception is good, because it means the developer's doing something stupid and he needs to be notified about it to fix it. Either way, even if you just want to look at this as just cleaning up after yourself, it's really important to get in the habit in a managed language, and well, in any language really, to do this sort of thing. And so, again, that's why we set callbacks to null on detach. Alright, so now let's go ahead and use our callbacks. On the onClick method, inside this if statement, I'm going to completely remove all the code in here, and I'm going to say callbacks.onLoggedIn. And that'll notify the parent activity. That's really about it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and run this application. Now, someone paying close attention might be saying, well, that sounds like a terrible idea. You're going to get an exception. And that is true. Watch this. I just want to show you guys what'll happen, the error that you're going to get if you forget to implement the callbacks on the login fragment. I want to show you guys exactly what error you're going to get. So watch this. You hit URL login, and you get, unfortunately, URL has stopped because, well, an exception was thrown. Then what you're going to do is you're going to look in your logcat right here. That'll show you the log of everything that's going on, and you'll scroll all the way up to the top of the exception to find the topmost exception, which is unable to start activity. Right? Well, that's not the area that we're really looking for. So let's go ahead and jump down to the next cause. So remember, this is nested. All of this is just nested exceptions. So the next cause is binary XML file at line 17. Error inflating class fragment. Right? So that gives us another hint that there was a problem creating our fragment. Scroll down. Now, what was that caused by? That was caused by class cast exception. Login narrow activity cannot be cast to callbacks. So now we see that that is the final cause, the root cause of this exception, of this program being terminated. Now we can click on this actual line of code right here, loginfragment.java, and we see exactly what line caused the exception, in this case our callbacks. And of course this error is resolved by implementing the callbacks interface. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go over here to login narrow activity, and I'm going to say extends base activity, then I'm going to say implements callbacks. And you see just by typing in callbacks, Android Studio correctly found our callbacks interface inside of our login fragment. So then we're going to hit enter, and now you will get an error. And the reason we'll get an error is because we haven't implemented the methods yet. We can do that manually, or we can do that really quickly by, you guessed it, hitting Alt-Enter, and then selecting Implement Methods, and hitting Enter, and then hitting Enter. Now we have our override public void onLoggedIn, the method that'll be invoked when we successfully log in. Now, what do we want to have happen when we successfully log in from the login narrow activity? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We want to set result, set the result code to result OK, and then, oops, not find view ID, finish. So when we're logged in, we set the result to OK and we finish. So we've successfully logged in. We want to defer back to the login activity so that we have the login logic only exist on one activity. All right, so that's our login narrow activity. Let's jump into our login activity and fix this guy. So you see he extends base activity, he implements onClick listener, but we're also going to implement callbacks. So let's go ahead and add loginfragment.callbacks. Again, I got that really quickly by just typing in callbacks with an uppercase C, noticing it found the one I wanted and hitting enter. Note that an import statement appeared at the top. Now we hit Alt-Enter, and Enter, and Enter to get our implementation of our onLoggedIn method. Now, what is the implementation of our onLoggedIn method? Well, it's pretty simple. Finish login. So that'll invoke the finish login method. Alrighty, there's one more problem with this code, with the way the logic is set up. It's going to require you guys to remember back a couple videos ago. I guess I'll just go ahead and show you guys. Let's go ahead and run this. So see if you guys can think of what is possibly going to go wrong here, because it's going to be a problem. Okay, so I'm going to do URL login, and then I'm going to click the login button, and I get my login activity. Click the login, I get my, that's weird, right? Come over here to the tablet, hit login, and I get my login activity again. Alright, so what's happening? Well, what's happening is the code is doing 100% of what we told it to, which is actually true of all code all the time. And what I mean is we are indeed navigating to the main activity. The problem is that the main activity inherits from base authenticated activity. The problem is with base authenticated activity is that if we're not logged in, we start the login activity and we finish ourselves. So basically, the problem is that the logged in flag on the user object, on the auth object in the application, wasn't set to true. Okay, so where in the whole chain of logic I have going on, which is pretty big at this point, where do you guys think I should go about setting that flag to indicate that we're logged in? Now, right now, we're just pretending, we're not writing real production, we are writing production code, but we're not writing code that's going to run against any service layer. We're just kind of putting in, test code right now. So let's assume that whenever the user presses the login button, that is logged in is set to true. Now, where do we put that logic? Now, remember, who is responsible for determining, or not determining, but logging ourselves in? Where is that one piece of code, that one class that's responsible for that behavior? That is going to be the login fragment. So all the way at the root. And this brings back why fragments are pretty awesome. Because I can come in here in this login fragment and I can change its behavior. And the behavior will change on both the phone and the tablet. But I won't have to do anything, despite the fact that both the phone and the tablet look considerably different. So that's really cool. Okay, so what do I want to do? On the onClick method, I'm going to go ahead and add some curlies so I can add multiple lines. Before I invoke callbacks.onLoggedIn, I'm going to say application.getAuth.getUser.setLoggedIn true. Now, of course, this will only apply statically, but that's okay for now. What I mean statically is it's only going to apply until the application's process is destroyed, then we'll have to log in again, but that's okay. Again, this is just for testing and demonstration purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and run. And that was weird. It went behind my IDE for some reason. Alright, so now if I come over here and hit login, check that out. We are on our main activity. And watch what happens when I hit back. Back. We exit the app, which is the behavior we want. Because now that we're logged in... Oh, go away. Now that we're logged in, when we go back into the activity, we go back into the main activity. Now for the phone, if we go into our login narrow activity and hit login, we are now in the main activity. So yeah, I think that's pretty awesome. Now we have a way of communicating back and forth between fragments. So we're not going to do a whole lot more stuff on fragments in this series. There's not going to be a need for it, because really, when you get to the point where you need to differentiate or create different views based off tablet and phones, and you can't do it with just simple different layouts, then you'll just do what I showed you guys over the last couple videos. You make a fragment, make a communications interface, make a fragment UI, and all that fun stuff. Oh, and another thing, a question that someone might think of, and I want to answer that just proactively, is over here in our layout, we could have, you see how we have our fragment login? we could have, just like we have with our activity login, we can have as many different versions of the fragment login for different screen sizes. So even the fragment itself can have different layouts depending on the screen size. But in this case, we just have one layout. Alright, so I think this pretty much wraps up this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one.